What's up everybody, my name is Chris and today I want to talk to you about a SoundPad application called Farrago, and it's made by Rogue Amoeba. This is an application that is only available for Mac OS, so if you're using Windows, this video is probably not for you. Now this application is specifically interesting for people that are doing live recordings or live streams, but also for people that are doing podcast recordings and want to, for example, include sound effects or similar things like intro, outro, or voice messages by your listeners. This application may also be interesting for theater performances, where you can use this to also play back background sounds or sound effects as you go. Now basically, and as you can see here on the website, this application is a rapid-fire soundboard. And it is really easy to use with shortcuts on your keyboard, and there are a ton of different functionalities available for this application. In this video, I want to give you an overview of how this works, different functionality sets in there, and of course also show you how you can actually use this together with something like OBS for live streaming. However, there's also another application that might be necessary specifically for being able to route audio between different applications. That application is Loopback, which also is made by Rogue Amoeba. And I will feature that in an upcoming video as well, which will be linked in the description below if you are interested to check that out. Now, I've been using another application by Rogue Amoeba, which is called SoundSource, for a really long time and purchased that myself. But now I also reached out to them to see if they could provide me with licenses for their other applications, because I think those are really cool and I would love to share them with you here on the channel. And that's exactly what they did. No money changed hands except for the license keys for these software pieces, and those include Farrago, Fission, as well as Loopback and Audio Hijack. And I will feature most of these applications here on the channel to kind of showcase how they work, what you might get from them, and of course in what kind of use cases they are actually useful. Because these applications might not be for everybody, but for those that are actually in need for these solutions, they are pretty much perfect. They're really well designed, robustly built, and overall just incredibly functional, again, if you need that functionality. In this video, we are focusing on Farrago. And as you can see right now on the screen, this is the interface that you get after installing this application. You get this sample grid of sounds that you can rapid fire play back by simply hitting these keys. For example, now if I hit G, it does a drum roll. And that is being played back as it goes. Now a quick interface rundown. Of course you have the center where you have the grid of all the different sounds that you have available to you. You can add new sounds by simply dragging and dropping them in here, and then you actually also already see that when you drag around a different sound, you have all these keys available to you. And that's pretty much all of the keys that you have available on your keyboard. So you have the numbers from 1 to 0, but you also have all the other keys and even combination keys with the option key so that you can assign those as well. You can also leave this in any of those slots. So even if you don't assign all the ones in between, you can see you can pretty much make any setup you want. Now I prefer everything in the left upper corner and as it is set up here in the sample, but I personally have actually stripped it down a little bit to the sounds that are more interesting to me. Now next to this center grid where you have all this available, you also have the top bar, you have the sets on the left, and you have an inspector on the right. Now the sets on the left is basically an option for you to set up different setups for different use cases. Whether that's different environments that you work in, or different sets, or also different sets of functionality. Because you can also separate these sets based on whether or not it's a list, like this here, for example, or this list. And that is actually a set which is not based on the grid, but instead it's a queued list of songs or sound effects that are going to be played back one after the other with a fade in between. In this list, for example, I have an album by Stream Beats made available by Harris Heller, and this would be played back one track after the other, and it is continuously playing back with a little bit of a fade in between each of the songs. This can be incredibly useful if you are, for example, doing a type of radio show, but you have to keep in mind that this list actually stops once it reaches the last track. But generally speaking, you can use this to simply play back a song one after the other and you have the controls on the right-hand side, which are similar to the grid, but it is a bit of a different situation. If you want to use it more like the grid setup that we had in the sampler here, then we want to take a look at this here. Now, one of the first things that I changed here when I set this application up is that whenever I hit this with a click, then it would immediately play the thing that is assigned here. The same effect is always true for the keyboard shortcuts, but the default setting for clicking on it is usually that you click on it once, and then it just selects the track or the sound effect, and then you click again to play it back. Now this can be done in the preferences, which will reach from Farrago and then go to preferences or command comma, and then here you have a setting which is single click trigger, which I have enabled. Now if you want to have the single click functionality enabled, but you also want to be able to select one track or one button and inspect it to make those settings, then you can do that by holding the command key, which is the key left to the spacebar. So then you can click on it, it's not going to be played back, and you have the inspector on the right-hand side for all the different settings. Now in these settings, you have a whole bunch of functionality. For one, you can actually trim the track so that you can basically make it shorter, or you can remove parts from the beginning as well as the end, as you can see here on the screen. There you can also preview it by hitting the play button at the top here, and you can reset it back to the beginning. Then next to that below, we have settings and notes. I personally don't use the notes, but you can write a text element to each of the single buttons that you have selected there or available. Then you have the volume, and that's volume A and volume B. So you have two different sets of volume that you can change this volume for this particular button. Now, in terms of volume, there's also a general master volume at the top here in the bar that you have also. And that also differentiates between volume A and volume B. Something important to note here, however, is that if you select volume B here, it does not automatically select the volume B of every single track. Instead, those two are basically stacked on top of each other. So if you select volume A for this button, it is always going to be played at 100% maximum volume, but that may be different depending on whether or not it's in master volume A or master volume B. And if you select the volume B, it's always going to be at 40%. And if you have the master volume at, for example, 20% or 40%, then it's actually going to be even less than that. So those are stacked together, basically. And to demonstrate that for a second, if I hit volume A and I have the master volume at A, then I hit this button, it's relatively loud. Now, if I go into volume B, this is going to be much less loud. Let's stop all here. So this is going to be less loud. But if I also go into volume B here, then this will be the quietest. And it's probably not even that audible anymore. Now, if I go into A again, it's a little louder, but it's still in volume B in the track mixer. So those are things to keep in mind here. It's not that you can change how loud this should be when this is set to B, but instead it is how loud should this sound be compared to all the other sounds. So that's something to keep in mind here. You then also have the availability for fading of the track. So you can fade it in or you can fade it out. The cool thing here is that you can actually see the fade pretty well in the graph up there in the waveform. So that's something that is really powerful to make it not as jarring to simply have a bit of a fade at the beginning and the end. Then we also have colors for these different buttons, which just makes it really easy to basically distinguish between things. And that way you can just manage all the things that are kind of related to each other a little easier. And now we are going into the most interesting functionalities for these buttons, because this is where they differentiate themselves the most. For example, you can set this to loop, and well enough, you actually see this also on the button here, and you can see this in all the other things that are also able to loop. Basically what that means is when you hit the play button on something that is set to loop, then of course it's going to be continuously playing back on and on again. So as soon as it ends, it's going to start from the beginning. Now, this is something that you see here on the button as well, but this is not true for the others. That is actually something that I would much prefer from this interface. So if I go into the solo mode here, then that would be great if I could also see this on the button here, but it is not that way. So if you hit the solo, you don't see it on this track. However, the functionality of the soloing is actually really cool because, for example, if you have the downbeat loop and you start this, and now you want to switch to the funky loop, you hit the 2, and it immediately switches over to that track. And this is because it is set to solo, and that means that once you click this playback onto the downbeat, it will stop all the other things going on. So for example, if I click the drum roll and the sax trombone, those will play at the same time. But as soon as I start playing back, for example, a downbeat loop, it will stop all the others. But can still play back other things. So if I play this, and I click the downbeat loop, you'll notice that all the others were stopped immediately and just the downbeat loop is playing. However, the same is not true in the other way around. So once the solo track is running, I can actually also play other sounds. So for example, playing this additionally to the downbeat loop. So this may be something that is really useful in certain circumstances, and specifically for those background loops, because you don't really want to have the downbeat loop and the funky loop playing at the same time. But you might want to add other sound effects on top of those loops. Now going down the list, we continue with the allow pausing and the only play when pressed. And of course, allow pausing means that if I now, with the allow pausing activated, let's do that on the drum roll, or let's do that on the sax trombone, allow pausing. And now if I hit the W and then I hit the W again, I actually pause the track and then it can play back from there and out. So if I hit the W, now it paused in the middle, and if I do that again, it paused again. The usual default behavior would be that basically I hit the play button, stop, it immediately stops completely, and I hit that again, it would actually start all the way from the beginning. This pausing functionality might be specifically interesting, for example, in the use case of podcast recordings where you have listener questions as a voice recording. There you can pause the recording or the playback and then answer a question as it was already asked, and then continue from that point forward without having to listen for everything from the start. So that's something where I can see this being really useful. Then lastly, we also have the only play while pressed. And that of course means that if I now hit the W, it will only play as long as I hold down the button. So if I start, stop, it just stopped playing. And this is as I don't press the button again. So if I hit this now, it's playing and it stopped as soon as I let go. Now I can also combine these two, so allow pausing and of course also allow only the playback when pressed. And now if I hit this, it stops where I left off, so it paused there, and then I can continue playing back. So there is a lot of functionality there. You can do a lot of things as this goes. And now lastly, we also have the output settings for this particular sound. So you can actually change that based on the different sounds that you're working with. And you can do so even with multiple sounds selected. So you can actually choose which output device should have these sounds and where should they be sent. But that's actually a topic that I also will cover toward the end of the video in terms of the output, because that's actually something where we have to talk about how that actually works in cooperation with other programs and output devices. Now, something really cool is that you can actually combine all of this with the shortcuts on the keys. So for example, we can now combine these and play all these back, and now with the funky loop, now we can actually add the bajing and have those, and like all those are combinable really easily. With the escape key, then everything stops playing, or pauses much rather. So that's also really cool. You can fade everything out. All that is really nice and dandy. However, these shortcuts actually don't work if the application is not active. So these are not global shortcuts, and that's probably for the better, because you still want to be able to type. And if you have all of these selected, it would be kind of weird if all the time there would be these sound effects playing as you are typing. However, for the purpose of bringing Farrago to the front and actually activating it so that you can work with it, there's actually the function to add a global hotkey to bring Farrago forward. So for example, you could do something like Command-Shift-F or something like that, And that means that now if it's not selected and I hit Command-Shift-F, then Farrago is in the front, and now I could actually have something playing back, like for example the sound effect. Now in line with this, there's actually also an integration with MIDI shortcuts. Let's just remove that shortcut for a sec because I don't usually use that. But there are MIDI controllers available, and you can also do shortcuts by using a MIDI controller. This is especially interesting if you want to include some of those MIDI controller drum machine-like systems. That could be really interesting there. And of course also the Rodecaster Pro, now the sound pads on that device actually also feature the functionality to be usable as a MIDI controller. So you could actually extend that and control these sound pads with the sound pads on the controller of the Rodecaster Pro. This, however, is something that I am not too familiar with because I don't have a MIDI controller available to me. So if you are interested in that, maybe you can find a different video that might be more suited toward this functionality and talking about that feature set. But what I do want to talk about here is the playback and the output and how you can get the audio from Farrago into other applications. Now, right now, as you can see in the general settings, I have selected the Telestream Audio Capture. And this is actually the capture device for the ScreenFlow application, which right now records the screen as I am doing this tutorial. Now, this is actually the place where you usually have all the other outputs available as well. So for example, the headphone output, if you just want to play back the audio on a speaker system, for example, you could use that. You can of course also use any USB connected audio output devices. However, some of those also feature multiple channels, and as you go into that area, it might be important to look into other solutions. The other thing is that if you want to use this, for example, in conjunction with OBS, and you want to have the audio played back here, you might also want to look into another solution, and that's called Loopback. This is an application that is also available on the Rogue Amoeba website and made by them, and that is actually an application that looks like this and is really, really powerful in their area of sending audio between different applications, capturing audio from applications, sending it to different output devices, monitoring devices, or being able to route certain audio into different places, which is extremely powerful and really, really useful, specifically for the purpose of combining audio from different applications and all sending it, for example, into a live stream. This application is not really cheap, but I find it's the most powerful application in this area. There are alternatives, like for example, I think one of them is called Black Hole Audio Interface or something like that. I will link that in the description below as well. But this here, the Loopback, I will cover that in more detail in an upcoming video. Now, if you want to, for example, use these sound effects and send them to a live stream with OBS, then you would do this as follows. You create a new virtual device, let's call that Farrago. Now we have a pass-through audio source and output channels. Now one way would be to actually just simply add the Rogue Amoeba Farrago here as one of the sources. Now having this set up like this, the audio capture in the loopback, and despite it not being selected as the audio output in Farrago, if I now play this back, it's actually going to be picked up by the loopback here. So if I play this, you can see the signal right here. So that's one way that you could work with this. Or you could also just delete this input and go into the settings of the Farrago, and here select the Farrago as the audio output. And now, as you can see, we have the audio going straight to the output channel here, mapped in loopback. And with that, we can open up OBS, we can add a new audio input, like the audio input capture right here, and that I already have set up right there. And here we can actually select the Farrago audio, select that, and now we have a new audio channel right there. And bringing this here, if I now go back into Farrago and I play the funky loop, you can see the audio here playing back right there in OBS. So that would be sent to the stream and everybody on the other end could hear that. And you, if you have set up OBS for monitoring, could also monitor these audio effects as you go through the stream. Now I will go into more depth with the feature sets of Loopback in that upcoming video that I mentioned. I will also have that linked in the description below so you can check it out there. Now that's my overview of the Farrago application, the soundboard for theater performances, live streams, or podcast recordings. I think it's really intuitive to use, it's really powerful to use also with the different options that you have available for these different sounds, and it is really reliable. Now, if you want to check out this application, you can do so with the link down in the description below. There is a trial version which lets you play up to 20 songs per restart. So for example, if you just have an intro and an outro and one voice message to play, that might already be enough. Otherwise, you can of course also acquire a license by Rogue Amoeba. Now, if you found this video helpful or enjoyable, I would appreciate a thumbs up. That always helps out a lot. If you have any questions or feedback, you can leave that in the comment section down below. Reach the website for this application in the description. And of course, with all that said, I hope you have an amazing day. Mix your audio live with Farrago, the soundboard, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.